To get on the hospital ship, he was the only black who was American. I think he was the only black on the ship. And they made it to the States, and he records the name of the ship and the pier number and everything else. And the guy who was organizing all these veterans, almost all of them wounded, was putting them up in hotels in New York City, all of them, and giving them a basic care kit and trying to get them squared away. And he was the one guy that they didn't get set up because he was black. So now he's in New York City. He had whatever money he had on him. He had already been able to, thanks to the friend Bob Scanlon that he had run into back at the embassy, I guess it was in Spain. They sent all his belongings. They sent his medals, all his paperwork, everything back to New York. And so that's how he ended up getting connected with all the paperwork to validate where he had been, the medals he had earned, the services he had done, everything. Thank God they had sent that back, and he was able to get that once he got relocated in New York, because they had a Veterans Bureau there in New York City. There were a lot of vets who'd fought in France and come back, and he joined that bureau, and that's where they had his stuff waiting.
Bob Scanlon, was he another volunteer for the Foreign Legion?
Yeah, Bob Scanlon was an old vet who had joined the French Foreign Legion, and he knew him, ran into him. He thought Scanlon had been killed, but he met him on this trip out of Spain. So it was like meeting a dear old friend.
Well, I can't imagine what it was like for Bullard, who has lived in France for decades. He climbs the ladder of success. He's a professional athlete, then he's a professional musician. He's a club co-owner, then an outright owner, entrepreneur, and everything. A war hero, someone who the government in France respects and trusts enough to make him an intelligence operative and not become a double agent. So obviously they respect him a lot. He has all that success, and then he comes to America, and it's essentially gone. Did he write what it was like to go through that?
He said New York was a lonely place, but they did have a Legionnaires group there. Although he was shunned from some of the meetings, he was able to attend some of the meetings as well. He had friends among that group and people he'd served with. And he also had enemies among that group because of his color. He was a very rare bird in terms that he was a black fighter pilot. And you have to wonder how many people took him at his word, that he'd actually done that. He managed to get a job, and he managed to find a home in Harlem, a home that he lived in for the rest of his life. He got a job. Now, he can speak French extremely well. Because of his background, he spoke extremely well. He was able to connect with people. He had a sort of a savoir-faire. And what was really big in the 50s in the U.S., especially in New York City, was French perfume. So darn if he didn't find a job as a perfume rep, where he made some pretty decent money because he had the language. He knew about Paris. He was selling Paris when he sold perfume. So he did extremely well with that. And he was able to find his grounding there. They also had a Catholic church in Harlem that offered a service in French because they had a large contingent of returning veterans who had come from France and French people who had come out of France to New York. So there was a large contingent of French in New York, and he also found a sort of a home there among them. So now he's kind of split. He still has a part of France there with him, which was kind of saved him. As he had terrible problems with stress until he got his daughters back, and with his spine, with his back, which had never completely healed. He really did get slammed up against that wall of that building pretty hard, and that affected him the rest of his life. But during his time there, it was quite interesting because de Gaulle had come to the United States, and he had contacted the White House, and he said, listen, he says, I want to get in touch with my old friend, Jacques Bullard. He's a hero of France. And the White House said, sorry, we have no record of Jacques Bullard. We don't know who he is. So the White House did some quick looking, knowing that de Gaulle was due to come in just a week or so. And by the time de Gaulle came, they did manage to get Bullard's address and contact number. And de Gaulle contacted Bullard himself and met with him in public and invited him to be one of 3 men that he asked to come back and light the flame of the torch of freedom in Paris as a special tribute to the veterans, the American veterans who helped to save France. Quite a moment. And Bullard was one of those 3 men.
When was this?
This was in 1960, I believe. It was after the NBC interview. I believe it was in 1960.
Okay, so after he's becomes his story is known again. from the period when he's in New York, he has friends with the French expatriate population and is trying to rebuild his life. From there to when he's working as an elevator operator in 1959, where our story begins, how does he get there? Is he continuing to work odd jobs and do whatever he can to make ends meet, or some other way?
Well, obviously he was selling French perfume, and he was doing pretty well at that. And the only other job we know that he had it for years, was an elevator operator. I think he became maybe too old to rep perfume at one point. So then he found the job at the NBC building. He also had some friends. One of his closest friends was an international singing star, a black guy named Paul Robeson. And anybody wants to look up Paul Robeson on Wikipedia will find out that this guy was a huge, huge talent. Robeson was a known activist who had a lot of communist ties. In fact, he took his wife to live in Russia for a couple of years. So he was a leftist who fought hard from the left. He wasn't like Martin Luther King, who fought from the center and brought peace from the center. Robeson was a muckraker, and he created a lot of controversy. And he would do concerts in Westchester County in New York, 25 miles north of New York City. And his third concert, what they call the Peak Skill Concert, he invited Bullard, who was now 55 years old, bespectacled guy, middle-aged guy, to join him at this concert. There were a lot of people who objected to the concert and didn't want to let the vehicles attending the concert in. So they formed lines that included state police, by the way. They formed lines of men to block the cars and the limos and the vans that were coming in to hear Paul Robeson sing and to hear Paul Robeson talk. And they started pulling people out of cars and beating them. And Bullard had taken a bus. They stopped the bus, broke the windshields, got the people out of the bus, and they were beating him over the head with clubs. And that's on YouTube. There was a guy who took a video, and that's out there on YouTube today. So here you got this tremendous hero with 40 medals who fought for France as an American and a Frenchman, and he's getting beaten over the head because he's going to a Robeson concert. It was definitely a shame and embarrassment for the state of New York and the city of Peekskill, one they'd like to forget forever. But there was a lot of hatred on the streets, and this was in the 50s.
Is that the reason that he's not well known today? Because at the end of his life, he's tied in with this activist movement?
I don't think so. I think the reason was because he fought for France and not because he fought for the U.S. The U.S. did try to make it right when the story came out. We had a 5-star general who was chief of staff of the Air Force, who in 1994 gave an honorary membership to the U.S. Air Force to Bullard once his story came out. And you go to the Air Force Museum, you'll find a special display there for Eugene Bullard. And you could say, well, it's a little late. But they did recognize his heroism, even though he did fight for France. And they recognized the fact that the United States should have brought him on as a pilot, and they didn't. But if nothing else, it tells us that America has come a long way in realizing what we owe to some of these guys and what we did to some of these guys. There have been a number of books written about Bullard. One was called The Black Swallows of Death, which incorporated a part of Bullard's diary. And the Black Swallows of Death was the unit, that Moroccan unit, that was it was cited more for bravery than any other unit in the French Foreign Legion. And there were other books as well that came out. All Blood Runs Red was another book that came out. But one guy really summed it up when he said that what a colossal waste of decades for America, in the time that it's taken America to get over their racial hatred. What a colossal waste of time and money and resources and human lives. And it's stories of people like Bullard, hopefully that'll bring us together as a nation one day.
Well, I'm curious on what your take is on Bullard's life, and if you could pinpoint anything of his legacy or his character that really stands out. Because as you were talking about his story and mentioning all these places that he ends up, it sounds a little bit like Forrest Gump, where he keeps showing up at all these important points in history. Except in that movie, Forrest Gump, Forrest just sort of stumbles in, and he's a passive recipient, whereas Bullard isn't passive about anything. He jumps in, he will show up at a foreign shore with no money in a foreign country with no language. Somehow he manages to work his way in. Somehow he grabs onto a foothold wherever it is and manages to climb up and do something. So What is it about his life that really stands out to you and thinks should be remembered above all?
There was a 3-word quote one of his author researchers said. He said, one thing about Jacques Bullard you can't help but ignore. He was game as hell.
There it is, game as hell. That should be the name of a biography there.
That would do good. There was a white lady in New York who befriended him. She was an author. Her husband was also an author. Her name was Louise Fox Connell. Mm-hmm. And her husband's name was Connell, and he had written a short story. I know that we did it, 1001 Classic Short Stories and Tales. And that short story was an excellent short story about a man trapped on an island and being used as game for a wealthy hunter. Mm-hmm. You might remember that story yourself. But she was his wife. She befriended Bullard, became very close to him, was his final biographer. Got most of the story actually from him. And he told her she was at his deathbed when he died. And he said she was crying and she was torn up. And he looked at her and he got his breath together and he said, "Don't fret, honey. It's easy."
There you go. That's another example of being game. When it comes to the final transition, he's ready. Well, this was fantastic. I mean, there's so much to get into on his life, and this is what you do on your show. You find stories like these that you hope people remember. So, John, if people want to find your podcast and other things you're doing online, where is a good place for people to go?
Wow, that's a great question. I actually have a network of podcasts. It's called 1001 Stories Network. And if you search that at Google, you'll find a website that our host puts up for us where you can get every podcast we do from all 8 shows that we have on board there. But our flagship shows are 1001 Heroes, Legends, Histories, and Mysteries, where right now this week you'll find we brought it back from our archives, All Blood Runs Red, parts 1, 2, and 3, the story of Eugene Jacques Bullard, as well as other World War I unsung heroes that we're including in this week. And usually we just come out every Sunday night at 7 p.m. Eastern, but this time we're trying to put a show up every day of the week. Also, our show 1001 Classic Short Stories and Tales is very, very popular, and a lot of great short stories from Jack London to Fitzgerald to Hemingway, all the great short story writers. We narrate those stories at 1001 Classic Short Stories and Tales. And from those 2 shows, you'll find lots of other great entertainment, from our ghost stories to our greatest love stories to our 1001 Stories for the Road, where we do long format stories. We'll do it chapter by chapter, and some great adventure stories that from Treasure Island to loads of others, all there for your enjoyment. At 1001 at Facebook, we're at facebook.com/1001 Heroes. At Twitter, we're 1001 Stories Podcast.
Okay, great. Well, we'll put that in the show notes, and listeners can check out all that. John, thank you for joining us.
Scott, thank you so much for having us on. It's great working with you. Good luck with your books going forward. I know all of you already know it, but Scott is a fantastic author and has put some fantastic books on the market. And we look forward to every opportunity we can to do interviews with him. And you'll find interviews with Scott Rank at 1001 Heroes.
There you have it. That is all for today's episode. Once again, I want to start things off by thanking the Spy Masters of History Unplugged. I'll explain what that is in a second. Our fantastic Spy Masters include Chris C., David Santee, Josh from VFW Post 2285, Jake Harrington, Jennifer French Lee, Josh Reddick, Jeff Mitchell, owner of Mountain West Commercial in Las Vegas, Michael from New York, Michael Piccinetti, Nick Brooks, Rob from Chicago, Ryan Gillen, Salvador Sanchez, Tom from Ohio, Moondoggy from Ohio, Bill Ivey, and Bruce Ashby from Wire Meets Wood Guitars at WMWGuitars.com. If you'd like to support the show, there's some very easy ways to do so. First, go to the site halfpricehistory.com. I've worked out an arrangement with a lot of the authors who've appeared on this show, and you can go there and get their books for 50% off. All you have to do is go to halfpricehistory.com and enter the promo code UNPLUGGED at checkout. Second, please leave a review and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast player of choice, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Stitcher or whatever. Third, join our Facebook group. You can go to Facebook and search for History Unplugged. There, you can talk with other fans of the show about recent episodes, what you liked, what you didn't like. Also, I have exclusive content there, such as live streams where I do live versions of podcast episodes where you can leave feedback as I'm talking, and I will address it